Waymon Hinson holds a PhD from the University of Mississippi and is licensed as a psychologist, marriage and family therapist. His work history includes 26 years with three universities, including Abineal Christian University, and 8 years with an American Indian tribe. Is affiliated with Agrarian and the Black Farmers and Agriculturists Association, Tulare, North Carolina. He also served as an advisor for the USDA Coalition of Minority Employees and the Justice for Black Farmers Group. His publication focused on Black land acquisition and dispossession up to 2017. He has completed a documentary with Shoun Hill, which chronicles the stories of African American farmers who prevailed against the USDA and DOJ in late 90s. Welcome on the show, Waymon.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you.
You know, Waymon, I am fascinated with your book, which is The Land Gain, Land Losses, the Odyssey of African Americans since Reconstruction. And I'm curious to ask you, how does this book come about? What inspired this book?
So there are two things that created the backdrop to bring this thing about. The short story is that I had written something in 2008 with Edward Robinson. And secondly, I'm a fairly prolific, frequent blogger on my blog. And so the editor for a journal called the American Journal of Economics and Sociology actually found me and asked if I would write this particular story. But as we got into it, he was rather surprised that I took the perspective that I took. And for me, the perspective that was important to take was the history of land acquisition from the very beginning that we know of all the way up to now. And so it's a lengthy article, 47 pages. Normally they're not that long, but the larger backdrop of why this is an interesting thing for me has to do with my involvement with Black farmers going back to 1994. So that involvement involved the larger story. I knew that the documentary was coming, and I wanted to study and develop the foundation upon which we would build the documentary. And so for personal and pragmatic reasons, that's why we wound up with this document.
Well, that's great. That's actually interesting because when I actually read the book, I was quite intrigued with a lot of section in it, and that's why I have you here to talk about it. Now, one of the shocking parts, reading your book under the sub chapters or subtitle of Brutality of Slavery in the Court and on the Land was where you talked about Sarah Ford's cruel experience in the end of her master's. Reading how his dad died due to torture is engrossingly tearful. And I'd love you to tell us a bit about this.
Okay. So we know that brought to the Americas 1619 and even before.
Wow.
And we know that it was important for these rich, wealthy white landowners to own people to work their land so they can make a profit.
Yeah.
Then there's a backdrop that says that Americans, or at least a portion of us, want to believe that enslaved people were happy enslaved Africans. They were happy to be here. They had work and they were happy to be on American soil. And I think that's a bunch of baloney. So between 1936 and 1938, a group of people, primarily white people, men and women, went to formerly enslaved people and interview them. It's called the WPA slave narratives. And so the slave narratives are such that if the formerly enslaved person trusted the interviewer would get really, really rich, raw information. And Sarah Ford's story is especially brutal because it shows that the slave masters would oftentimes do just about anything to keep their enslaved people under control. Now, on the one hand, an enslaved person would cost a lot of money. There's an article out on the internet that talks about how an enslaved person now would be equivalent to buying a pretty wealthy automobile, pretty expensive automobile. And so on the one hand, the enslavers would want to treat them well, to feed them, have medical care, that sort of thing. But on the other hand, enslavers would do anything to keep their larger enslaved population under control. So what better way to do that than to have somebody who is run away and is captured by the patrollers and brought back to treat them unmercifully, so that when the other enslaved people would be in a circle watching all of this transpire, they would say, I don't want that to happen to me, so I'm going to behave myself.
Absolutely.
And so sometimes an enslaver would sacrifice one person in order to keep the 50 under control. So it's insulting, regardless of how well the enslaved Africans were treated. On the other hand, some enslaved Africans were treated with the utmost brutality. Wow. And that's what you get out of the WPA slave narratives. It's an ugly, ugly scene. I think this is America's deep, darkest secret, is our original sin, the way we have treated first people and the way we have treated people from Africa.
Wow, that's actually sounds quite deep. Because when I actually read about that part, I remember I went on Google and I made some research about Sarah Ford. And what I read about her was quite so sad. You know, you also wrote about the factors that influence land laws among African American in the United States, in a part of which you spoke about the systemic racism, the USDA policies, and the division of IRS property through petition sales, and the evidence compiled by plaintiff in the Pigford class action lawsuit. You know, considering all of these factors, what can you say about the current condition of Black farmers in America today? What is the current state of Black farmers in the US today? Has there been any remarkable and positive changes, or it has gone to worse?
There are two things going on.
Okay.
One that shows there's hope for a bright future for Black farmers. And that hope is that there are people in the cities who are saying, I want to go home. So grandma would have owned 50 acres in North Georgia or North Carolina. And so that city cousin is going to go back home and live around country cousins and become farmers. That's hope. On the other hand, we are fighting tenaciously against the powerful forces of the USDA, and therein lies our pessimism. Let me situate that, Peter, just for a moment.
Okay.
The USDA is the largest agency within the United States government. It employs over 100,000 people in over 4,500 offices around the world. Its budget is approaching something like $2 trillion or something, or no, I didn't say that right. The budget is approaching 132 billion in 2022, and in 2021, 146 billion. So in order for a farmer to farm, that farmer has to have money ahead of time, to have the tractors, to have the land, to have the seeds, to have the fertilizer, and everything that goes with it. So when a Black farmer goes to the local county office of what's called the Farm Service Administration, they apply for a loan. And if you run an operation that's $500,000 and they're going to let you have $50,000, that's not enough money.
Mhm.
So if you're a Black farmer or an Indian farmer or a woman farmer or Hispanic farmer, you're going to get too little money too late in the growing season. And when the crops are, when the money comes due, your loan comes due, then your crop is not going to be enough to pay off that debt. So
Debt.
you are already behind the curve.
Mm.
Now, another piece of that that's really tragic is that Black farmers are rejected for their loans to the tune of 42%.
Wow.
White farmers are rejected on their loans to the tune of 5%. Now, the Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, the guy that we're fighting these days, and that's another long story that we may not have time to get into, he says that he's going to provide money for these counties and for farmers to train them up on how to fill out the loans so as to get more yes answers. Now, the people that I work with say that that is a bunch of malarkey, that Black farmers do not need training in how to fill out applications. They need, if they are indebted to the USDA, they need debt forgiveness so as to be able to start all over again. Which leads us up to your question about the Pigford.
Yeah.
The Pigford class action suit is known as one of the most expensive governmental functions in the history of the U.S. So Pigford 1 cost somewhere around $1.4 billion.
Oh.
Pigford 2 cost around $1.2 billion. Now let me tease that out for you, Peter. Under Pigford 1, if you were a Black farmer and you had farmed or attempted to farm between 1981 and 1996, you were eligible to apply. Okay. So over 22,000 Black farmers applied for admission into the class called Pigford Class Action Suit. Now, about 16,000 were admitted to the class. Okay, 16,000, 22,000, 16,000. Now, within the parameters of Pigford, they were promised compensatory damages, they were promised debt relief, and they were promised what's called priority of services. It would not be held against them. They could apply for more grants and funding. They could apply for low interest loans and that sort of thing. Now, most farmers, most of that 16,000 got $50,000 for compensatory damages. Some got $12,500 for tax relief. But guess how many of that 16,000 actually got debt relief? 371.
Wow.
So we think, us white people in America think that Pigford is a great deal for Black farmers.
Yeah.
But when there are 22,000 apply, 16,000 are admitted, most of them get $50,000 compensatory damages, and some get $12,500 for taxes, and only 371 actually get debt relief. The fact of the matter was that in 1999 or 2009 or whenever, $50,000 won't get you much.
Wow.
Farmers applied for that because they were promised debt relief. And so the people that we're advocating for right now are something like 3,200 Pigford legacy farmers,
Wow.
3,200 Black farmers who still are aggrieved because they didn't get satisfaction under Pigford 1. Now, that's a long story. That's a short story. It's very complicated. More of that is found in Hinson and Robinson 2008 and in that 2018 article. It's a long, sad, tragic story.
Wow. Wow, that's quite deep and resounding. Now, in your attempt to demystify how Black Africans were captured during the slave trade and subjected to slavery, you wrote about Olaudah Equiano, who was captured in his homeland, Isaki, presently known today as Nigeria, where currently live.
Right.
Now, could you tell us a bit about Olaudah Equiano's story?
Sure. He is a rather fascinating character.
Wow.
He tells a story in his autobiography, and it's been written in 9 different iterations, how he was born in what is now Nigeria.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how far that would be from where you live, Peter, but born in Nigeria and enslaved at roughly 11 years of age and traveled all over the world, West Indies, America, United Kingdom, on and on and on. Now, the curious thing about that is that he is the first person who wrote in the first person about how tragic Middle Passage was, what it was like in the bowels of the slave ships to be stolen from his homeland and to be brought to these other countries. So he is the origin of what's called the slave narrative. So we need to give him a big kudos.
Yeah.
A big kudos. Yeah. Now, on the other hand, there's an expert on this gentleman here writing these days. His name is Vincent Coretta. Now, Coretta, in his studies, says that all of this may not be factually correct. This guy, Dr. Coretta, Vincent Coretta, believes that there's more evidence that this gentleman was born in South Carolina. Now, nobody doubts the veracity of what he described in terms of the slave ships.
Okay.
What it's like to be stolen from your land, that sort of thing. Nobody doubts that, but people are, kind of yes or no in terms of, was he really born in Nigeria? Now, on the other hand, in the article, I used his story to make a point, because he describes in his autobiography how the land, the community from which he was stolen, was largely agrarian, because he talks about the type of crops they would grow, types of animals that they would raise. And so my theory is that white enslavers from America, from Africa, and wanted them intentionally to come to America to work the land. And then so if you have enslaved Africans tilling the soil, growing beans and peas and corn and cotton and rice and all the other stuff, some things that were imported from Africa, then they would do very, very well. And then slavers would make more money. And then if you follow that thread, once freedom came with the end of the Civil War, it was only natural for those formerly enslaved Africans to now become land, to continue working the land, either for somebody or for themselves. So again, if you look in the article, 1900, 1910, 1920, African Americans became prodigious land owners. And at one point in time, formerly enslaved Africans were something like 14% of all farmers across the USA. So that's the theme that I was tracing And that's why I used Oquendo, Olaudah Aquino,
Yeah.
Equiano rather, for
Yeah.
that particular purpose. He was an agrarian from an agrarian community.
Wow, that's great. That's quite fascinating.
Well, thanks.
Yeah.
Just an idea.
So thank you, Wilson, for coming on the Fox section. I join you back in the second section.
Okay, I look forward to it. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.